Well, welcome everybody. It's with great delight that I'm here to introduce Professor Habiba Badaroon to speak about her wonderful edited collection, Surfacing, on being Black and feminist in South Africa. This is an incredible seminal collection, which I urge absolutely everybody to acquire. It makes for dense, rich, exquisite, moving, and invigorating and stirring reading at the same time. This is a launch for the African Feminism Conference. My name is Nadia Davids, and I'll be asking Professor Badaroon, Habiba, some questions about the collation of the book, the dreaming it into being, and hopefully Professor Desiree Lewis will be joining us later as well. And then just to give a very brief overview, this is a collection of essays from a range of different South African women writers, Black women writers, who are asking arresting and important questions in their works, while also offering a series of very beautiful meditations and reflections on what it means to be and make and do and think and write and become. It's apart from anything else for me, I found it to be an extraordinarily moving collection of works. So joining us from Pennsylvania, Habiba Badaroon is a literary scholar. She's also an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies and African studies at Pennsylvania State University, where she also co-directs the African Feminist Initiative. Many of you will know Habiba's work as a poet. Many of you will know her as an extraordinary feminist Islamic critical thinker, and many of you will know her as all of those things and the complex way in which her work flows between thinking critically and making creatively, and the porousness of those boundaries. So a very warm welcome, Habiba. It's always a joy to be in conversation with you. So I'm going to start by just asking a very simple question, because so much of the book is, for me, it's centered around this question of narrating the self and the biographical. And so I wanted to ask you what your own first encounters were with feminism, both within, I suppose, the home space, because I know that you had an astonishing feminist role model, whether it was she was self-described in that way or not, in your mum, but then what your first encounters with critical writings around feminism were as a way to language one's own experience. So there's two questions. The first is the early feminist question, and the feminist question where one begins to understand the world in, I suppose, critical language.
Let's see. So the family, yes, a wonderful space in which to live and think one's reality into eventually the philosophy and the theory that guides your life. And I was fortunate in that the normality that surrounded me and disappeared into the background because it was so ordinary was one in which my mother worked outside the home as a doctor and my father was a house husband. And so this set of ideas where the parents had a certain configuration that was unusual. And my brother was the one who was gifted in cooking and decor and a sense of color. And my sisters and I were nerdy readers. This gave me a certain set of ingredients that made for, I think, a feminist life, and or at least a beginnings of a feminist life. And this was either countered by the other normalities I encountered through my friends and through television and through life in apartheid South Africa, or it was further deepened as I discovered through going to high school at Livingston and university at the University of Cape Town, where you and I met. So I think my induction into feminist thought really started more formally at university. I had been reading novels for years. I had been drawn to music and those spaces where I found female liberation represented. And it was at university that these formalized themselves into feminist theory, although I'd embraced the term feminist since my teens. And it gave me many reasons for ardent, fervent, infuriated conversations with people who didn't believe that word belonged in anyone's vocabulary. But formal education, it was probably Dorothy Driver's feminist literature courses. And of course, that is really an anchoring beginning point for me. And then further expansion of my ideas into African feminism came later. And I would say that that's really the area where my thinking and my joys circle at the moment.
I mean, I think that's such a rich and layered introduction, because it really does. I mean, so much of this wonderful book is precisely about that entanglement between the political self and the personal self, right? And but also very often the line between psychic hurt and political hurt, but also the recovery space between the two. And you mentioned Dorothy Driver's class, and I did the same one, I think, a few years later. And I think that was the first time that I encountered, in a very focused way, reading Zoe Wickham. And the first time that I really, really could grapple and engage with the multiple ways in which feminism plays out in experience and on the body. And of course, Wickham is one of the writers that you have featured in this book. And I want to talk about that. Sorry, move my camera for a second. I want to talk about her contribution as well in a second, but to also just ask you, what drew you and Desiree towards saying that it would be the essay, that the form of the contributions? I mean, I know that there is a very complex and interesting and riveting interview here, but the majority of these contributions are in the essay format, and there is that relationship with the biographical. So what was it that drew you towards that form?
I think the essay has been an underappreciated form as a vehicle for thought, for philosophy, for politics. It has been weighed, I think, unevenly against the academic article and the academic book, and all of that formality of language and that set of expected articulations that are often very heavy and have their authority in the academic world. But the personal essay, on the other hand, as these 20 contributions show, can take a variety of really expansive forms. And it has produced for us a level of wit and level of engagement and beautiful writing, which I think for me is the central gift of this book. So in addition to the content, and it is a rich encounter with feminist thought from the Southern region. This is true of the content of the book. The form, I think, is far from a minor detail. It is also the intensely powerful and evocative vehicle for the thought and the politics of these writers. So the essay had not been seen in, I think, this way before, and certainly not in this abundance. And we think that it has achieved what we hoped it would, which is to give a certain freedom to the writers, and then for them to take that and to produce new knowledge that I think is urgently necessary.
No, I agree. And I think there's something about so many of the writers, in fact, come out of the academic space with all those possibilities and brutalities of what that space has often meant for women,
Right.
women of color, certainly in the academic spaces that you and I come out of. They're complex and loaded and quite vexed spaces sometimes. And I think what's so interesting about so many of the contributions here is a kind of a synthesizing of that knowledge and the combining of the self, and then the giving birth to this different form of writing and thinking. And also, perhaps this is the moment for the narration of the self in this way, because the texts are so open and free. And there's disagreement and argument even within the pages of the book. And I loved that as well, that there were these incredibly complex ways and various ways of how to be a Black feminist. And was that part of the way you and Desiree went about curating, or was it just a happy kind of outcome?
It was deliberate, and there were accidents, and there were new ideas along the way, and there were also ideas where we hit our heads and said, oh no, these people should be in here. And already it was a list of 20 contributors, which I think was twice as many as Wits had originally envisaged. but it's something that we really pushed for, because this is the first ever gathering of Black feminist writing in the publishing history of this country. And I should give credit that it was commissioned by a Black feminist commissioning editor at Wits, Roshan Kader. And the combination of those factors means that as editors, we took on a large task, but we're also part of a community that in many ways presents itself, has been very active in activism, in teaching, in creative writing, in publishing, a central point here in the book. So there were certain people who invited themselves in some ways. There were others we really asked very fervently to be in. And then there are others who need to be in the books that follow this one, because it can only be a first step. It should definitely not be the last word on Black South African feminism.
Right, and I think that's always what I'm always struck by in your work, Habiba, is it's incredibly generous and generative, and that you not only create new spaces and ways for people to think, and for all of us to, well, those of us who have the privilege of feeling directly addressed by you in your writings, it becomes really a realm of possibility. And I think that's such an important part of scholarship, but also of creativity, in which to say this is signaling the beginning of something. It's not declaring it a sealed space in any way. But I mean, having said that, there's so much that would be almost difficult to imagine what else, because the book has texts about, you know, boats of solidarity leaving for Gaza, on decolonial farming practices, on what it means to be a publisher. There's Jackie Job writes an extraordinary piece about sexuality and creativity. There's such richness across the board. And so I'm wondering about the process of fitting all these pieces together, and what kinds of threads of continuity you saw, or discontinuity you saw, between them.
Again, there was this gorgeous experience of being a reader of these essays when they were coming in, and realizing how they spoke to this context, which, as you point out, is a complex task to address. It has complicated tensions, and it can't pretend that to respond to all the challenges comes from a unified feminist perspective, which would be false. So we found in reading it that there were certain suggestions. For instance, the essay you mentioned by Jackie Job, which I found in some ways a challenge to myself. I thought, this woman is an extraordinary dancer, choreographer. How dare she also be a superb writer? No, it's just too remarkable. And she writes about religion and sexuality and the becoming of a woman. She writes the way you do, with an attentiveness to language that just, for me, raises an entire atmosphere, an entire universe. She writes, Makosazana Tlaba writes about what it is like to be an inheritor of a feminist mother and a feminist grandmother, in this beautiful essay about cultivating her own body's pleasures. And there's an essay from Grace Musila about what it means to be a woman who becomes more and more accomplished, and generates, therefore, in some men, an increasing anxiety as her achievements accumulate. So these threads of the body, of the becoming self, of a religious perspective alongside a feminist perspective, which I think is not automatic. You've mentioned Islamic feminism, in which South Africa is actually amazingly gifted in terms of the scholarship that has been generated here. And we are lucky to have Fatima Sidat and Sadia Sheikh both in the collection, speaking about the gender of divinity. You know, must God be a father, for instance, and what is the meaning of that for feminist thinkers, for feminist activists? have Gertrude Fester Wickham speaking about her own history as an activist and the presence and absence of sexuality and gender in the anti-apartheid struggle. We have Mary Hames, who is one of those figures whom feminist students in the 2015-2016 movements cited as one of their inspirations, speaking about her own student days in the anti-apartheid struggle, also challenged by the silencing of gender and sexuality and what it is like to teach feminism and teach sexuality today. And so the themes arose out of what the essays presented. And at the same time, the writing was the strongest binding force among all 20 contributions. And so I'm unafraid to say this is a beautiful book to read as well.
I'm increasingly wondering, as somebody who also tries to think about these things, I'm increasingly wondering, like, what does visibility mean, and what does it look like? And I'm just curious if that was one of the conversations that you and Desiree Lewis were having, was how do we make space for these texts, stories?
I think one of the erasures we were addressing, and that I think this book addresses very, very powerfully and very effectively, is the idea that Black women belong in certain realms in Southern Africa. And those are the realms of autobiography, testimony, in fact, a sort of entertaining level of trauma that has to be revealed and consumed and then patted aside. And the absence of Black women's voices in making the public sphere, in making politics, in the reshaping of urgent political questions, of philosophy and theory, the presence in the academy, these were all fraught and contested and suffer from several erasures. So part of what the book is doing is indeed contesting that invisibility, which has become, I think, a default where Black women's visibility is constrained in ways that are very bad for the whole. And at the same time, I think you're quite right to ask about this idea of simple visibility. It is a simplistic visibility which we were contesting, in that the space that Black women's voices were heard in were very narrow. So to simply ask for visibility is an old request by now. And instead, the nature of that visibility and what we do with it, and to call attention to the forms that have already achieved such profound transformations in the public sphere, which I think, for instance, feminist poetry has done in the past more than 2 decades. And I think that those transformations and their effects need to be registered. So a book like Our Words, Our Worlds, edited by Makosazana Klaba, one of the contributors to Surfacing, actually narrates that effect, that rise to visibility and the forms of visibility and then the effects it has had. To also draw a line between what counts as a feminist generational leap from the era, for instance, of Miriam Tladi and people who are of her generation, and then of our generation, and then the students who come after. I think that was also one of the important themes, where the kinds of questions feminists are asking have changed. And one of the most extraordinary changes for me has been to watch this new generation of feminists refuse to ask feminist questions as a secondary round of liberation. They refuse to make sexuality and gender the thing we will ask for next, and instead make it primary alongside what counts as the most important political struggle.
The book makes space for that as well. for the fact that there's a multiplicity of generations coming together. And yes, there are some discontinuities, but there are also moments of terrific interface as well. And I wondered what that was like for you and Desiree in thinking through those moments of connection.
Yeah, if it were just Desiree and me and the happy accident of the community that we gather naturally around ourselves, we might have had a gathering of groups that met in the 1990s and, part of founding moments in feminist history. But we had to be very conscious of that instinct. And certainly there are people who we were part of groups together in the 1990s. But there are also people whom we read at that time and adored, and the people who are making the new theories now, and gathering all of these into a conversation was one of the great joys of the book. And also one of the challenges, of course, that we had to ask people whom we venerate to contribute, and we had to ensure that the people who were making the kinds of feminist advances now were also included, were also welcomed. And I think the book does that. But again, it's a beginning. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that we defined what counts as South African in, I think, an innovative way, not because it emerged from our own thinking, but because it reflects who is speaking, who is teaching, who is writing, who is part of the activism in our country. And to have excluded people who are from Zimbabwe and Kenya and Eswatini because their passports don't say South Africa would have been an extremely narrow interpretation of the purpose of this book. So it offers a vision of South Africa that is based on belonging and contribution and participation, as opposed to a simplistic legal framework. And that,
Yes.
I think, is one of the gifts of the book.
I loved that too. And this idea of one can find belonging in this book, and a place to call home and a way to describe oneself as well. I think in any given essay I pick up, I feel as though I am being addressed. And that's a rare feeling, I think, to have, and one that's very treasured as well, regardless of which kind of context the writer is speaking far more to. I mean, on that idea of approaching intellectual and creative lodestars, there is a very riveting, intellectually rigorous interview in this book about one of the most seminal moments in South African or even African feminism generally, and perhaps we can even expand that and say global feminism, is the sort of contestation over the way in which Sarah Baartman is memorialized. And this very, very textured conversation takes place between Desiree Lewis and Zoe Wickham. And there are moments of hesitation and disagreement, which are very honestly rendered in that dialogue. And so I was wondering about if you could just speak a little bit to the complexities of that dialogue.
Yes. The interview between Desiree and Zoe definitely was a foundational moment and addresses a foundational topic, and in my view belonged at the beginning of the book. And fortunately we were able to frame it in that way. And you'll notice, of course, that in the introduction we address this issue of the hypervisibility of people like Sarah Baartman and Winnie Mandela. And they also start the book in the form of essays by Sisonke Msimang and the dialogue between Desiree and Zoe Wickham. And they also address an important erasure, another one of the erasures that surfacing contests, of Southern African feminisms in what counts as global Black feminisms, which is an important field and one that I heartily endorse. But I contest what are its emphases and its absences. And among its absences is intellectual feminist work from the southern part of Africa, whereas icons like Winnie Madikizela Mandela and Sarah Bartman are highly visible in that scholarship. So
Right.
part of what the introduction addresses is what kinds of visibility are granted to South and Southern Africa, and why it is important for us to be able to speak into that space, an important space that, for instance, our students allude to all the time. They allude to a global Black feminist lineage, a heritage, but in their own allusions, many of the students I was reading until relatively recently, not the most recent students, but until relatively recently, were only speaking about, at most, African American scholars.
Right.
And
So what these figures mean through the prism of the global north, as opposed to what it would mean to actually think through them from the global south, or from just from our own kind of
yes,
student longitude. Yeah.
and even to be aware of the scholarship that is coming from here. So when Wickham and Lewis speak about the contestations around the representation of Bartman here, it adds a level of texture that just is not visible elsewhere. You know, people get basic things wrong, like where she's buried. And it's about a level of detail that is part of an ordinary lived experience of what Batman means here. And the very nuanced conversation that includes differences between Wickham and Lewis and the scholars they are, the students and the activists they are discussing, I think it needs reading in its fullness, in its depth. I don't want to summarize it here, except to say it does justice to the fact that we can't imagine a space of Black feminist criticism and then say it's one thing. It must be varied and multiple, and it is. And it has depth and it has contestation. And that is part of what is growing the field and its activisms. And probably a very good example of that is precisely the 2015-16 movements, where there was hearty contestation.
So I was very happy to see precisely that complexity, because I think that we're not always afforded the chance to actually really go into that sort of fine-grained discussion, that fine-grained discursive space where it is possible for two extraordinarily arresting thinkers to be broadly on the same side, or even specifically on the same side, but even within that, to have very, very different approaches to how one might view a single historical, well, a very important historical moment, but then a series of historical instances that emerge from how to go about memorializing this figure. So I thought that was very, very, apart from anything else, it's very timely, it's very necessary, and there's an urgency to the collection, which I just think is really wonderful. I mean, on that note of global feminisms, I think it makes such a strong intervention around that. And I think certainly Leanne Naidu's essay on how troubled that idea of international solidarity can be sometimes, where she writes about these very, very difficult and fraught conversations that take place on that boat to Gaza between all the different women identifying women aboard, and their mission of how to approach this moment of great activism and solidarity. And so I'm wondering, you're in the States and you're working there. What do the textures of that conversation feel like, and what can American scholars take from this to, let's say, inform and shape their activism, as opposed to it always being understood as being one directional?
Yes, I think the reciprocity is one element that is central to what I hope will be that effect. Also, in the way that Desiree and I frame it in the introduction, it's certainly not only a matter of pointing out the inadequacies of this relationship. There are relationships that have been extremely nourishing. Beverly Guy Sheftool, Margaret Busby, Carol Boyce Davies have been figures who have always been attentive to the voices and the spaces. In fact, there's an entire field of post-colonial feminism and third world feminisms and Black feminisms in the US that is directly attentive to not simply making women from the third world into this average icon. So we do absolutely acknowledge that, but there are pressures in terms of academic trends, in terms of publishing and commercial pressures that tend to make certain parts of the continent less visible and others more visible. For instance, among West African feminists that are who are more more visible in the US. So I'm hoping that what this book will do is to provide a really weighty, substantive way in which to expand that understanding of where feminism does, where feminism is, where feminism makes, where feminism moves. And I think that precisely this, the substance of this book will do that.
Yes. I mean, I think one of the great treasures of the book is that it's deeply accessible without compromising on intellectual rigor. And that's not something to be easily achieved. It's the result of very beautiful writing, and each piece is sort of a set piece that can hold its own, but it's also the result of wonderful curation on the part of you and Desiree.
Thank you for this nourishing conversation. And you're right that it's aimed to be read and loved, certainly to be taught, but to be next to one's bedside, to be the thoughts that are swirling around in one's dreams, because it's also visionary and a dreaming book, a book that was dreamt into being, and a book that is filled with dreaming. Its last essay, as you point out, its last few essays are about the earth and how our hands on the earth help to sustain it or not. And so this vision of a future that is thought from the southern part of the African continent and thought of and envisioned so beautifully and with such a sense of connection and community it's one of the most beautiful pieces of writing I've ever read. And so I hope people will find the same when they do.